The first thing Lydia Vale noticed that morning was the sound the collar made when she swallowed. It gave a faint dry rasp against her skin, like paper dragged over stone. Mrs. Bell had fastened it before sunrise in the upstairs bedroom of the Vale house, pulling the tiny pearl buttons together one by one while Arthur Vale stood near the window and reminded everyone that important people would be watching. The lace had come all the way from Boston. Mrs. Bell had said that twice. She had handled it with the careful pride one might show a communion veil or a judge's robe. By noon, the edge of it had rubbed Lydia's throat raw. She sat beneath a canvas awning in the square at Ash Creek, while the July heat pressed down through the cloth. The table before her was covered in white linen. Silver knives flashed every time the awning stirred. Flies worried the glazed ham, the bowls of peaches, the butter softening in its dish. Someone had placed a vase of roses beside Lydia's plate, though every petal had begun to curl inward from the heat. The whole town had come to see her eat. Men stood in the shade of the mercantile, hats pushed back, pretending to discuss freight prices. Women gathered in pairs under parasols and studied Lydia over their fans. Children had been ordered to keep their distance, but they peered around skirts and wagon wheels with the bright, unashamed interest children gave to circus animals. Lydia kept her hands folded in her lap. The blue dress Arthur had chosen was too heavy for the desert. The skirt held the heat around her legs, and the tight sleeves pinched when she bent her elbows. She had not worn shoes with heels before the riders took her from the mountains. Each step in them made her feel as though the ground had been moved half an inch farther away. Arthur sat at her right, wide in the shoulders, silver at the temples, his black coat buttoned despite the weather. He smelled of bay rum, tobacco, and the leather folder he had carried everywhere for 3 days. On Lydia's left sat Mayor Abel Rusk, whose round face shone with sweat. He kept wiping it with a folded handkerchief, then tucking the damp cloth back into his sleeve as if no one had noticed. Today, Rusk announced, lifting a glass of warm champagne, Ash Creek welcomes home one of its own. The crowd applauded. Lydia looked past them to the northern road. It ran pale and empty between 2 rows of buildings, then narrowed beyond the last corral and vanished into heat. Far beyond it rose the dark line of the mountains. They looked blue at this distance. At home, their slopes were brown, red, green, and black, changing by the hour. From Ash Creek they had been flattened into a single color, as if the town could make even mountains less complicated by standing far enough away. Arthur put his hand over Lydia's folded fingers. His palm was cool, his grip was not. "You may smile," he said without moving his lips. She did not. 3 days earlier, his hired men had entered the canyon at dawn. They had worn dust-colored coats and carried new rifles with oiled stocks. Lydia had been grinding corn while Kestrel repaired a saddle strap beneath the juniper tree. The first shot struck a cooking pot and sent it spinning into the fire. The second took a piece out of the rock beside Kestrel's head. He could have killed 2 of them before they reached the lodge. Lydia knew that. The men knew it too. They kept their distance and shouted that they had legal authority, that the girl was a stolen heir, that soldiers would come if Kestrel resisted. Kestrel had looked at Lydia for a long moment. Then he set down his knife. That surrender had frightened her more than the rifles. They tied his wrists anyway. They made him kneel. One of them struck him across the mouth when he spoke to Lydia in the quiet language they used between them. She had bitten the man's hand hard enough to taste blood. After that, they bound her arms and put her across a saddle like a sack of grain. Kestrel had not fought. He watched her leave with blood at the corner of his mouth and a stillness in his face that she understood. "Live through this," it said. "I will come." Arthur squeezed her fingers under the table. "Your grandfather has spared no expense in bringing you back," Mayor Rusk continued. "For 10 long years this unfortunate child lived beyond the reach of church, school, and decent society." A murmur moved through the crowd. Lydia watched a hawk circle above the livery roof. "She was taken during the plague winter," Rusk said, "stolen in the confusion by a roaming Apache." The hawk tipped one wing and disappeared behind the courthouse chimney. Lydia's plate remained untouched. There was roast beef under a skin of cooling fat, boiled carrots shining with sugar, and a square of white bread. She could smell cinnamon from the peach dish. Underneath it all lay the sweeter perfume worn by the women nearest the table. Lavender and rose water fighting the odors of horse manure, hot boards, and dust. The lavender made the back of Lydia's throat tighten. For 1 second, the square vanished. She was 4 years old again. lying on the floor of a cabin while smoke pressed beneath the door. Her mother's hand lay open beside her, gray in the firelight. Outside, men shouted. Canvas snapped. A horse screamed until the sound ended suddenly. Then cedar replaced smoke. A stranger's arms lifted her. A rough blanket covered her head. Against his chest, beneath the pounding of his heart, she heard a voice that did not promise everything would be well. It promised only that she would not be left there. Lydia came back to the square when a spoon struck a plate. Eleanor Price had stepped from the crowd carrying a glass of lemonade. She was a narrow woman in a brown dress, perhaps 45, with flour still caught in the seam of one cuff. Lydia remembered her vaguely from before the sickness. A warm kitchen, a red scarf over bread dough, a baby crying in another room. Eleanor approached as if nearing a skittish horse. "You must be thirsty," she said. Arthur's hand lifted from Lydia's fingers. "Mrs. Price, the girl has been offered everything she requires. I'm sure she has." Eleanor's eyes remained on Lydia. "But the day is cruel." She set the glass near Lydia's plate. Beads of water slid down the crystal. A slice of lemon floated against the rim. Lydia could hear the ice knocking softly inside. For the first time since morning, thirst pulled at her more strongly than caution. Eleanor saw it. She moved one hand toward Lydia's collar. "This is cutting her," she said. "Look, Arthur, there's blood." Arthur's jaw tightened. "It will soften. It should be removed. It is proper dress." Eleanor's fingers stopped an inch from the lace. She looked at Lydia, asking permission without words. Lydia stared back. Eleanor had lived across the wash from Lydia's mother. On the last day before the guards blocked the road, she had brought a jar of broth as far as the white quarantine rope. She had set it in the dust and retreated when Mayor Rusk's men shouted. Later, dogs had knocked the jar over. Lydia remembered kneeling near the rope, watching broth soak into the dirt. Eleanor's face had been at the window across the wash when the cabins burned. She had watched. She had also wept. At 4, Lydia had not understood how a person could do both. At 14, she did. She did not drink the lemonade. Eleanor lowered her hand. Shame passed across her face so quickly that most of the crowd missed it. Lydia did not. "I am sorry," Eleanor whispered. Arthur heard. "There is no call for apology. My granddaughter has been returned to safety. We should be grateful." He rose and faced the crowd, drawing himself tall. 10 years ago," he said. "My daughter Margaret was lost in the epidemic. Her child vanished the same night. I exhausted every means available to find her." Lydia turned her head. That was the first lie he told while looking directly at her. She had seen the letters. Kestrel could not read English when he found her, but over the years Lydia had taught him from the journal, labels, old newspapers, and a torn primer traded from a peddler. When she was 9, a missionary passing through the hills had carried 2 letters from Kestrel to Arthur Vale in Santa Fe. Both returned unopened. A third came back with a note from Arthur's clerk, stating that the child of Margaret Vale was legally presumed dead, and that further correspondence would be treated as fraud. Arthur had begun searching only the previous spring, when a territorial judge ruled that Margaret's land could not pass cleanly to him without proof of Lydia's death or Lydia's living consent to his guardianship. His concern had followed the law by exactly 6 weeks. "My men found her in deplorable conditions," Arthur continued, "without education, without religion, unable, apparently, even to speak. Some people looked at Lydia with pity, others looked relieved. A silent girl could not contradict them. Mayor Rusk laughed too loudly. We shall teach her soon enough." Lydia pressed her tongue against the back of her teeth. Beneath the blue dress, against her breastbone, rested a small piece of turquoise on a leather thong. Mrs. Bell had tried to remove it. Lydia had kicked over the washstand and held the broken pitcher shard until they allowed her to keep it hidden under the bodice. The stone was smooth from 10 years in her hand. When she touched it, she remembered mornings in the canyon, Kestrel blowing ash from the coals, coffee made from roasted mesquite, wet rawhide hanging from a line, the dull knock of a stone pestle, ravens arguing above the cliff. She remembered learning to place her feet where shale would not slide. She remembered Kestrel sitting awake through her fevers, his back against the lodge wall, sharpening nothing for hours because the scrape of stone on metal helped her sleep. Arthur spoke for a long time. He praised the town. He praised the men who had brought Lydia down from the mountains. He praised himself without using the word. By the end, the butter had collapsed into a yellow pool, and the flowers had drooped over the rim of the vase. Then Mayor Rusk leaned toward Lydia. "Stand, my dear." She remained seated. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes hardened. The people of Ash Creek have waited 3 days to hear your voice. Arthur's hand settled on her shoulder. Tell them you are happy to be home, he said. The square quieted. A wagon creaked somewhere behind the hotel. A baby fussed and was hushed. From the kitchen door of the saloon came the smell of scorched onions. Lydia looked from Arthur to Mayor Rusk, then to Sheriff Jonah Mercer, who stood near the courthouse steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Mercer had not joined the speeches. He was a lean man with a sunburned neck and a mustache gone gray at the edges. On the ride into town, he had met Arthur's party at the southern gate. He had stared at Lydia's bound wrists and ordered the ropes cut. He had not ordered her released. Now his gaze dropped to the red mark above her collar. Speak, Arthur said softly. Lydia looked north. Nothing moved on the road. Still she waited. The church bell began to ring. It did not ring for noon or a funeral. The first strike came hard and crooked, followed by another before the metal had stopped vibrating. The sound tore across the square. Birds burst from the courthouse roof. People stood so quickly that chairs fell backward. A woman screamed before anyone knew why. Men ran for the rack of rifles inside the sheriff's office. Plates shattered under boots. The celebration loosened all at once, linen snapping, glasses spilling, the carefully arranged world turning into dust and noise. A boy on the water tower leaned over the rail and pointed north. Rider, he shouted. One rider. Sheriff Mercer crossed the square at a run and took his Winchester from the courthouse wall. No firing unless I say. The militia formed a broken line across the road. Some had coats half on. One man still held a napkin in his rifle hand. Mayor Rusk backed toward the courthouse, leaving his champagne on the table. Arthur seized Lydia's arm inside. She pulled against him. Lydia, do not be foolish. She planted both feet. A thin column of dust had appeared beyond the last buildings. It grew slowly, not the rolling cloud of a group at speed, but a single steady line. The rider did not hurry. Arthur dragged harder. The collar bit Lydia's throat. Pain flashed beneath her jaw. Then the wind changed. The lavender thinned. The greasy smell of the feast slipped away. Rain came into the air, though the sky above the town was still bright. Beneath it, Lydia caught cedar smoke, horse, sun-warmed hide, and crushed mint. Her body knew before her eyes did. She stopped pulling away from Arthur. She became utterly still. The rider emerged from the glare. He sat a chestnut horse dark with sweat. His buckskin shirt had been patched at one elbow. His hair, threaded now with more gray than Lydia remembered seeing 3 days before, was tied at his neck with a narrow strip of red cloth. There was dried blood along one side of his mouth. His wrists were bruised where the hired men had tied them. He carried no rifle. A knife hung at his belt, but his hands rested in plain view on the saddle horn. Kestrel rode toward the line of guns as if it were weather. Sheriff Mercer stepped into the road. Stop there. Kestrel stopped 10 paces from him. The chestnut blew through its nostrils and stamped once. Dust drifted around its legs. Every rifle in the line pointed at Kestrel's chest. He did not look at them. He looked at Lydia. For 3 days she had held herself inside a silence so tight that even tears could not escape. The town had mistaken it for emptiness. Arthur had mistaken it for obedience. Only Kestrel understood that she had been saving her strength. Arthur's fingers tightened around her arm. He has come to take you again, he whispered. The sheriff will deal with him. Kestrel's face did not change, but his eyes asked one question. Are you hurt? Lydia lifted her free hand and touched the collar. His gaze dropped to the lace, then returned to hers. Something in him went colder than anger. Arthur tried to pull her behind him. Lydia twisted hard, slipping her arm from his grip. He caught a handful of blue sleeve, but the seam tore. She jumped from the raised platform, landed badly in the heeled shoes, recovered, and ran. Someone shouted her name. The militia did not know what to do. Barrels swung toward her and away. Sheriff Mercer reached out as she passed, then stopped himself. Her skirt dragged. One shoe came loose and turned under her heel. She kicked it off without slowing. The other followed 3 strides later. Barefoot, she crossed the hot road. Arthur's voice rose behind her. Clara, Lydia, stop. He used both names because he did not know which one belonged to her. The first drop of rain struck the dust beside Lydia's foot. Then another. She reached Kestrel's horse and caught the worn leather of his stirrup. For one heartbeat, she could not breathe. The collar held her chin high. Her throat burned. Kestrel leaned down, one hand opening toward her. Lydia tore at the pearl buttons. One came free, then another. The lace loosened. The word rose from a place deeper than language. Father! It broke across the square louder than the bell. the militia rifles lowered by inches. Arthur stopped shouting. Mayor Rusk's face lost its color. Kestrel bent from the saddle and lifted Lydia as easily as he had lifted her from the burning cabin 10 years before. She struck his chest with both hands, once, twice, not in anger, but to prove he was solid. Then she clung to him. His arms closed around her. For the first time since the riders came, Lydia allowed herself to shake. Kestrel held her until the shaking eased. He said something low against her hair, too soft for the town to hear. I came. She nodded against his shoulder. Rain began falling in wide, dark drops. They struck the road and raised the smell of wet dust. Sheriff Mercer kept his rifle lowered. The girl calls you father. Kestrel looked at him. She chose the word. His English was deliberate and rough at the edges, learned over campfires from Lydia's patient corrections. Arthur pushed through the militia line. She was a child when he took her. She has been trained to say whatever serves him. Lydia turned in Kestrel's arms. No, she said. It was only one word, but the town reacted as though a second bell had sounded. Arthur stared. Lydia's voice was low from disuse, yet clear. He did not take me. Mayor Russ moved backward another step. Lydia saw it. So did Sheriff Mercer. Kestrel set her on the ground beside the horse. His hand remained at the back of her shoulder. The rain strengthened, tapping on hats, wagon roofs, and the stretched canvas above the abandoned feast. Sheriff Mercer looked from Lydia to Kestrel. Then tell me how you came to be with him. Arthur snapped. She is exhausted and confused. I asked her, Mercer said. Lydia slid her fingers beneath the loosened collar and pulled. The lace tore with a soft ripping sound. She dropped it in the mud. Then she looked at Mayor Abel Rusk. He found me in the fire you ordered. No one answered her. The rain drummed harder on the awning. Water ran down the courthouse steps in thin brown streams. Mayor Rusk stood with one hand gripping the lapel of his vest, as though his heart might escape if he let go. I ordered no such thing, he said. Lydia remembered his voice before she remembered his face. 10 years earlier, Ash Creek had been smaller. There had been no brick courthouse, only a plank office with a stovepipe leaning out the back. The hotel had been 2 rooms above a saloon, and the north road ended at the Vale Orchard, where Margaret Vale grew apricots that the birds always found before she did. Lydia remembered the orchard in pieces. A ladder against a tree, the sticky skin of fruit, her mother's brown hair pinned up with a yellow comb. She remembered sleeping in a trundle bed and waking to the sound of Margaret coughing in the kitchen. At first, the adults called it a summer fever. Then the barber's youngest boy died. 2 women from the laundry took sick. A freight driver arrived with sores along his arms and collapsed beside the well. By the end of the week, the church bell rang every evening, and no one counted aloud how many times. The town stretched a white rope across the eastern wash and moved the sick beyond it. There were 3 cabins there, a line of canvas tents, and an old tool shed that became an infirmary, because the doctor refused to enter the camp. Food was left on stones. Water barrels were rolled downhill and stopped before the rope. Margaret's fever came on a Tuesday. She packed a blanket, a tin cup, Lydia's second dress, and the leather journal she had kept since girlhood. She did not argue when the masked men arrived. She only asked that Lydia be allowed to stay with Eleanor Price. Eleanor had stood in her doorway with her baby against her shoulder. I have the little ones, she said, crying before she finished the sentence. Margaret, I cannot risk. Margaret nodded. She had not made Eleanor say the rest. Lydia went across the wash with her mother. For several days, Margaret could still stand. She swept their cabin with a bundle of grass. She boiled water over a small stove and sang when Lydia became frightened by the coughing in the tents. At night, the camp smelled of lye, sickness, wood smoke, and the vinegar people soaked into rags and tied over their mouths. The town sent less food each day. Mayor Rusk visited from the safe side of the rope. He wore a black coat and held a folded cloth over his nose. Men gathered around him, store owners, ranchers, the stage agent, and Arthur Vale's business representative. Arthur himself was in Santa Fe. Margaret had written to him twice after becoming ill. No answer came. Lydia was playing with a wooden spool near the cabin wall when she heard Rusk say the eastern road had to remain open. The army post has already marked us, one merchant said. Another death and the freight companies will turn south. Rusk stared at the tents. Then the camp must be made temporary. The doctor asked what that meant. Rusk did not answer in front of him. That afternoon the guards stopped carrying water across the rope. Margaret grew too weak to walk. Lydia filled the tin cup from a puddle beneath the barrel stand and strained the water through a strip torn from her petticoat. Her mother drank one mouthful and gave the rest back. "You first," she said. Lydia refused. Margaret smiled. The sickness had swollen one side of her face, but Lydia could still see her mother inside it. "There is a blue stone in my sewing box," Margaret whispered. "Your grandmother wore it when she crossed the plains. Keep it close." Lydia found the sewing box beneath the cot. Inside were needles, black thread, 3 buttons, a thimble, and no blue stone. Margaret closed her eyes. Then I must have sold it. She had sold almost everything during the first year after Lydia's father died. The silverback brush, the second horse, her wedding ring. The land remained because it had belonged to Margaret's mother and was tied to Lydia by the old will. "The journal," Margaret said later. "Do not let them take it." Lydia carried the book to her. Margaret wrote through the night in a hand that shook so badly the pen scratched through 2 pages. She recorded the names of the dead. She recorded the days the water stopped. She recorded the wagons that came after dark carrying lamp oil rather than medicine. Near dawn, voices rose outside. Lydia looked through a crack in the wall. Masked guards were moving from tent to tent, ordering those who could walk toward the dry riverbed. Most could not. One man dragged his wife by the shoulders until a guard struck him and told him to leave her. Mayor Rusk stood near the rope with a lantern. The wind was blowing east away from town. Lydia remembered that because Margaret asked which way the smoke would travel. "Toward the hills," Lydia said. Her mother closed the journal and pushed it beneath a loose board near the wall. "Listen to me." Margaret's breathing came in small, wet pulls. "When fear tells you that you are alone, fear is lying. There will be someone. Perhaps not the person who should have come. Perhaps not the person you expect. But look for the one who stays." Lydia began to cry. Margaret drew her close. Her skin was burning. Outside, glass broke. Then came the splash of oil against canvas. The first fire caught in the infirmary. Wind pressed it flat, oranged the ground, then lifted it into the tent roof. People shouted. A woman ran with her nightdress burning and fell before she reached the wash. Guards on the town side pulled the rope tighter and used rifle butts to drive back anyone who came near. Lydia heard Mayor Rusk shouting that no one was to cross. "Keep the road clean," he yelled. "Let it burn out." Margaret tried to stand, her knees folded. Smoke entered beneath the door. Lydia dragged a blanket to the water basin, but the basin was empty. She pressed the dry cloth over her mother's mouth. The cabin wall grew hot against her back. Margaret's hand searched for Lydia's face. "Find the one who stays," she said. Those were the last clear words Lydia heard from her. The roof began to pop. Sparks came through the chinks. Lydia crawled to the loose board and pulled out the journal, but it was too heavy to hold, while she tried to move her mother. She tucked it beneath Margaret's arm and pulled at her wrist. Her mother did not move. The door opened, not inward. It was kicked from outside and struck the wall hard enough to break one hinge. A tall man stood in the smoke with a blanket wrapped around his mouth. Lydia saw a bow over one shoulder and a knife at his hip. His hair was loose. Fire shone behind him. She picked up the stove poker. He crouched instead of approaching. His eyes moved from Lydia to Margaret, then to the flames working along the rear wall. He said a few words Lydia did not understand. His voice was low. He pointed to himself, then to the door. Lydia held the poker tighter. The rear window shattered from the heat. The man crossed the room in 2 strides. Lydia swung. The poker struck his arm. He did not take it from her. He gathered Margaret's blanket around Lydia, lifted her, and turned toward the door. "My mother!" Lydia screamed. He stopped. For a terrible second, she thought he had not understood. Then he looked back at Margaret. He crossed to the cot and touched 2 fingers beneath her jaw. His face changed, not much, but enough. He saw the leather journal under her arm. Lydia reached toward it. The man took the book, pushed it inside his shirt, and carried Lydia out. The camp was a field of fire. He stayed low and moved behind the cabins, away from the guards. Once a rifle cracked from the rope. Dust jumped near his foot. He did not turn. Lydia's blanket slipped and she saw bodies in the firelight. People she knew only by voices. Mr. Crowley, who whistled through his teeth. The laundry woman who had given Lydia a peppermint. The freight driver's wife holding an empty bucket. The stranger reached a horse hidden in the cottonwoods. He put Lydia in the saddle and climbed behind her. She fought until he gave her the stove poker, which he had somehow carried with them. She clutched it across her lap while he guided the horse into the dark. From the ridge, Lydia watched the cabin roof fall. The stranger let her watch. He did not tell her to be brave. He did not say her mother had gone to a better place. He did not turn her face from what remained. When the flames had lowered and the first edge of dawn appeared, he opened a small pouch at his belt. From it he took a piece of turquoise, blue-green and irregular, drilled through the top and hung on leather. He set it in Lydia's palm. She had never told him what Margaret said about the missing stone. The stranger closed her fingers around it and placed his hand over hers. Then he pointed to the brightening sky. "Not gone," he said in broken English. It was one of the few English phrases he knew. Lydia did not believe him. But she kept the stone. His people called him by a name she could not shape correctly then. Traders used Kestrel because he watched from high places and missed little. Lydia used that name until she learned his own, and later kept using it because it had become theirs. He took her north, not west toward the larger camps, because she still carried fever, and he would not bring sickness among families. For 12 days they stayed in an abandoned shepherd's shelter beneath a basalt wall. Kestrel slept outside. He left food near the entrance and backed away while she ate. He boiled willow bark, cleaned her skin with warm water, and burned every cloth she sweated through. On the third night, Lydia woke choking and called for her mother. Kestrel came inside. She threw the tin cup at him. He sat against the wall until morning. The next day she asked why he had not left. He did not understand every word, so she pointed to herself, then toward the trail, then made walking motions with 2 fingers. He looked at her a long time. "No," he said. That answer was the first stone in the house they built between them. The house did not rise quickly. For months Lydia hid food under her blanket. She woke whenever Kestrel moved. She screamed if smoke thickened in the lodge and refused to sleep near a closed door. Kestrel changed the fire pit so the smoke escaped better. He left the entrance flap tied open even in cold weather. When winter came, he built a second opening at the rear, narrow but large enough for a child. He never asked her to forget. In spring, he brought her to a canyon where water ran clear over red stone. Several Chiricahua families camped there among oak and juniper. Lydia expected questions. She expected hands on her hair, arguments about whether she should stay, perhaps fear of the sickness that had followed her. An old woman named Sani gave her a bowl of stew and complained that Kestrel had let the meat cook too long. A boy 2 years older than Lydia challenged her to climb a cottonwood. A mother with a baby showed her where to sleep. No one asked her to explain the dead. Kestrel's sister had lost 2 children to soldier's fever years before. She understood silence. Life in the canyon was not the easy freedom Ash Creek later imagined. Water had to be carried. Corn had to be ground. Winter wood had to be cut before the first snow closed the upper trail. There were hungry seasons. Soldiers patrolled the valleys. Ranchers poisoned springs or fenced paths used for generations. More than once the camp moved before dawn because a scout saw sunlight on a distant rifle barrel, but no one treated Lydia as a relic. She learned work according to her strength. She cleaned hides badly at first and ruined a basket by soaking the wrong fibers. She learned to roast agave in a stone pit, to find onions after rain, to tell mule deer tracks from pronghorn in hard ground. Kestrel taught her to sit without fidgeting when they watched a trail. Sani taught her that patience was not the same as obedience. English thinned in Lydia's mouth. Another language took its place, then both lived together. Kestrel learned English from her. At night she read Margaret's journal aloud. The early pages held recipes, household accounts, and small complaints about Arthur Vale. Lydia translated what she could. Kestrel listened as though each ordinary line mattered. June 4. Lydia lost her left shoe in the creek and insisted a fish had stolen it. September 19. The apricots are poor, but Eleanor brought flour. December 2. Arthur writes that sentiment is expensive and land must be made useful. I begin to think a person who calls mercy waste has never paid its true cost. Kestrel repeated unfamiliar words until he could say them. Sentiment, he said one night, frowning. Feeling. Then why not say feeling? Because English likes to wear extra clothes. He looked at the long word again. Like your grandfather, Lydia laughed. The sound surprised both of them. It was the first time Kestrel heard her laugh. He did not smile broadly or call attention to it. He returned to mending the bridle, though the corner of his mouth changed. Years accumulated in such moments. At 7, Lydia learned to ride alone. At 8, she stopped keeping food beneath her bedroll. At 9, she read the final pages of the journal without Kestrel beside her. Margaret had written the names of the men who brought the oil. She had copied Mayor Rusk's order word for word and pressed the signed paper between 2 pages. The official sheet remained there, smoke-browned at the edges. At 10, Lydia asked Kestrel whether he had known the book might punish the men in Ash Creek. I knew it belonged to you, he said. That is not what I asked. He considered. Truth is not a knife. A knife does what the hand asks. Truth waits. For what? For the person who needs it. At 12, Lydia began asking about the Vale land. Kestrel told her what traders had heard. Arthur had leased pieces of it, borrowed against other pieces, and tried to have Lydia declared dead. He did not tell her what decision to make. Would you hate me if I went back? She asked. Kestrel was scraping hair from a hide. He continued until the strip was clean. No. Would you follow? If you wished? And if I stayed, I would make room near the winter fire. She became angry at him for not choosing on her behalf. It took another year to understand that his refusal was a form of love. Arthur's riders came the following summer. There were 7 of them, led by a man named Pike who carried a folded territorial warrant. It named Lydia as Clara Lydia Vale, minor heir, unlawfully held by unknown persons. It authorized her return to Arthur, pending a guardianship hearing. Kestrel read enough English to understand the trap. If he resisted, Pike would call it proof of kidnapping. If men died, soldiers would follow. The canyon held children, elders, and 3 women near childbirth. Lydia told Pike she would not go. Pike smiled. Your grandfather said you might be confused. I am not confused. The court can decide that. Kestrel stepped between them. Pike's men lifted their rifles. Lydia watched Kestrel calculate distance, wind, cover, lives. She saw the exact moment he chose not to give the men the war they wanted. He placed his knife on the ground. Pike tied him and searched the lodge. He found the journal beneath a stack of blankets but could not read the pages because Lydia threw hot ash into his face. In the confusion, Sonny took the book and passed it through the rear opening to a boy waiting outside. The boy rode north before Pike understood it was missing. Kestrel said nothing while the men bound Lydia. His eyes stayed on hers. He had taught her how to survive capture, notice hands, horses, water, direction, and the man most eager to prove himself. Do not spend strength where it cannot change the result. Do not mistake stillness for surrender. On the second night of the ride, Lydia heard Pike tell another man that Arthur planned a celebration before the guardianship papers were signed. Once the girl puts her mark down, the old man owns every acre from the wash to the mesa, Pike said. After that, she can stare at walls for all he cares. Lydia lay under a blanket and pretended to sleep. The next afternoon, they reached Ash Creek. Arthur embraced her in front of witnesses. In private, he asked where the journal was. That was how Lydia knew he feared it. She had spoken no English after that, until now. The rain ran down Lydia's face as she stood beside Kestrel in the square. She had not told the whole memory aloud. She had given the town only its sharpest edge. Mayor Rusk forced a laugh. A child's nightmare, nothing more. Kestrel reached toward the blanket roll tied behind his saddle. The militia raised their rifles again. He stopped with his hand in view. Sheriff Mercer said, slowly. Kestrel untied the roll. From inside he drew a leather book darkened by smoke, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a strip of rawhide. Lydia's knees weakened. Kestrel held it toward her first. She placed her palm on the cover, but she did not take it. Sheriff, she said. Mercer approached. He handed his rifle to a deputy and accepted the book with both hands. Arthur moved forward. That belongs to my family. Lydia looked at him. You returned it unopened. It is the private writing of my daughter. It is the record of the people your friends burned. Sheriff Mercer removed the oilcloth. The journal's leather was cracked, its corners black. When he opened it, the first page gave a small sigh. Rain spotted the paper. Eleanor Price stepped under the edge of the awning. Take it inside before it is ruined. Mercer glanced toward the courthouse, then at Mayor Rusk near its steps. No, he said, we read it here. Rusk's hand slipped from his vest. Mercer turned pages carefully. He saw Margaret's neat early handwriting become thinner, then ragged. He saw columns of names. He saw dates. The square listened to paper moving beneath the rain. Near the end, a folded sheet lay between 2 pages. Mercer opened it. The seal of Ash Creek, blurred by smoke but still visible, appeared at the bottom. Above it were 3 signatures. The sheriff read the first name silently, then the second. When he reached the third, he looked up. Mayor Abel Rusk had already begun to run. He made it 3 steps. The wet boards betrayed him. His boot slid at the edge of the platform, and he struck one knee against the railing. Before he could rise, Deputy Sloan caught the back of his vest. Rusk twisted with surprising strength. One of the pearl buttons flew from his waistcoat and bounced across the steps. "Unhand me," he shouted. "I am the mayor of this town." "Then stand still like one." Sheriff Mercer said. Rusk froze, breathing through his mouth. The square had changed. The same people who had leaned toward his speeches now leaned away from him. No one rushed to help. The town clerk stared at the ground. Two merchants who had sat beside Rusk at the feast removed their hats, not in respect, but as though a funeral had started unexpectedly. Mercer held the paper beneath the awning and read aloud. By order of the Municipal Council, all structures east of the quarantine boundary are to be destroyed before first light on the 9th day of August, for the preservation of trade, public confidence, and the health of Ash Creek. The rain struck the canvas so hard that he had to raise his voice. Any person remaining within the marked district is to be prevented from entering the settlement by whatever force is required. A low sound moved through the crowd. Mercer read the signatures. Abel Rusk, Mayor; Horace Bell, Councilman; Edwin Pike, Acting Marshal. Lydia looked toward the hired rider who had brought her from the canyon. Pike was not among the militia line. He had left Ash Creek that morning after Arthur paid him, but several men knew the name. One spat into the mud. Mayor Rusk found his voice. That order was written during an emergency. We believed the camp empty. Eleanor Price stepped forward. It was not empty. Rusk stared at her. Eleanor's hands shook, but she did not stop. I heard them. Everyone on the west side of the wash heard them. Her husband, Thomas Price, stood in the militia line with a rifle held across his body. Ellie, she looked at him. You heard them too. Thomas's face tightened. You told me the wind made strange sounds around the sheds, Eleanor said. You said it because our children were in the room. This is not the place. It is the only place we ever had. Thomas lowered his eyes. Another woman spoke from near the hotel. My sister was in the second tent. A man beside the livery said, the guards would not let me cross. Voices rose, separate at first, then overlapping, names surfaced. Small memories people had buried beneath work, weather, births, and funerals came back into the square. A blue shawl seen near the fence. A child calling for water. Oil barrels unloaded after midnight. The smell of hair burning. For 10 years, Ash Creek had carried the same memory in many houses and called it silence. Mayor Rusk pulled against Deputy Sloane's grip. You all agreed. Every family in this town was at risk. Do not stand there and pretend you wanted plague brought to your doors. The confession quieted them more quickly than denial had. Sheriff Mercer folded the order once. Did you know people remained in the camp? Rusk's lips moved. Answer. I knew some could not be moved. Lydia felt Kestrel's hand settle on her shoulder. She did not need it to remain standing, but she was grateful for the weight. Mercer's expression emptied. Deputy, take him inside. Arthur Vale stepped between Sloane and the courthouse door. On what charge? Mercer looked at him as if noticing him for the first time. Murder will do until the territorial judge supplies a more elegant word. Arthur kept his voice controlled. A journal written by a fevered woman is not proof of intent. The order says the buildings were to be destroyed for public health. Tragic decisions were made across the territory during the epidemic. The mayor just admitted he knew. He admitted there were invalids who could not be moved. That is not the same as ordering their deaths. Lydia watched Arthur speak and understood that he had rehearsed such arguments long before this day. He was not shocked by the paper. He was measuring the damage. Mercer understood too. How did you know what the order said? The sheriff asked. Arthur's eyes flickered toward the sheet. I heard you read it. You described its defense before I finished. That is absurd. Kestrel spoke from beside Lydia. He asked for the book. Arthur turned sharply. You know nothing of what I asked. I know men who search a home for paper and leave food, blankets, and silver where they find them. The hired riders had torn Kestrel's lodge apart. They had opened every pouch, split a cedar chest, and shaken Lydia's bedding. They had not been looking only for a child. Arthur faced Mercer. This man entered town in defiance of a lawful guardianship order. He has held my granddaughter for a decade. My name is Lydia, she said. Arthur ignored her. Arrest him, Sheriff. Then we may discuss the authenticity of this supposed record in a proper court. Mercer glanced at Kestrel's knife, the lowered rifles, the girl barefoot in the mud. Did you take her from Ash Creek? Kestrel answered. I took her from a burning cabin outside it. Did she ever ask to leave you? No. Mercer looked at Lydia. She understood the question before he asked it. I asked him once whether I could return, she said. He told me he would bring me if I chose it. And did you know? Arthur made a disgusted sound. She was a child shaped by isolation. Lydia faced him. Then why did you wait 10 years? The question landed cleanly. Arthur's mouth closed. She took one step toward him, mud pressed between her toes. "Why did you send back the letters?" "I received no reliable letters." Kestrel kept the envelopes. For the first time, Arthur looked toward the saddle roll with fear rather than contempt. Kestrel untied a smaller packet. Inside were 2 envelopes stamped in Santa Fe, each marked "Return to Sender" in dark ink. Arthur Vale's business seal remained across the back. Sheriff Mercer held out his hand. Arthur said, "Private correspondence is not evidence of any crime." "No," Mercer replied, "but it tells me where to begin looking." Rusk laughed once, a broken sound. "You fool, Arthur. You said the fire would solve it." Arthur turned on him. "Be silent." The words came too quickly. Rusk stared at the man who had just abandoned him. Rain streamed from his hair into his eyes. "You said Margaret's claim was the only obstacle. You said if the camp was gone, the Eastern Road and the Vale Tract could both be cleared." Arthur's face went still. Lydia heard the crowd draw breath. She had known her grandfather wanted her land. She had known he ignored the letters. She had not known he had been part of the fire. Kestrel's hand tightened once on her shoulder, then eased. Arthur spoke carefully. "A desperate man will say anything to share his guilt." Rusk leaned forward against Sloane's grip. "You were not so careful 10 years ago." Sheriff Mercer raised one hand. "Enough. Both of you will answer questions inside." Arthur took a step back. "You cannot arrest me on the word of this coward. I can keep you where I can find you." 2 deputies moved toward him. Arthur looked at the militia. These were men who had borrowed money from him, sold cattle through him, depended on his freight contracts. An hour earlier, half of them would have stood between him and any lawman. Now not one raised a rifle. Arthur's gaze settled on Lydia. Whatever grandfatherly mask he had worn finally fell away. "You ungrateful little animal," he said. The square went silent. Kestrel moved no more than half a step, but every man in the road felt it. Lydia lifted her chin. Without the lace collar, the motion belonged to her. Arthur saw no fear in her face. That frightened him more than Kestrel did. Sheriff Mercer nodded to the deputies. They took Arthur by the arms. As they led him toward the courthouse, the leather folder slipped from beneath his coat and fell open in the mud. Papers slid across the wet boards. One stopped near Lydia's bare foot. At the top, in heavy black type, were the words "Petition for Guardianship and Transfer of Mineral Rights." Beneath them, a line waited for her signature. Lydia bent and picked it up. The rain softened the paper in her hands. Across the square, Arthur twisted to look back at her. For the first time that day, he was the one who could not speak. Lydia held the petition by one corner while rain loosened the ink. The paper had been prepared in Santa Fe 6 weeks earlier. Arthur's name appeared in 3 places. So did hers, written as Clara Lydia Vale, surviving issue of Margaret Vale, presumed restored to sound custody. The language was dense, full of words that made theft appear orderly. Stewardship, management, improvement, consolidation. Near the bottom, someone had made a faint pencil mark where Lydia was meant to sign. Beside it lay a second line for a witness. Mrs. Bell's name had already been written there. Lydia looked toward the woman who had dressed her that morning. Mrs. Bell stood under the mercantile porch, one hand over her mouth. She had boasted about the Boston lace. She had smoothed Lydia's hair and told her not to worry, that Mr. Vale would guide her hand if she had forgotten how to write. Now she could not meet Lydia's eyes. Sheriff Mercer gathered the scattered documents before the rain destroyed them. There were survey maps, mineral reports, letters from a railroad company, and a draft agreement granting Arthur control of the Vale Tract for 30 years. A red pencil line crossed the map from the river to the northern ridge. It passed directly through the quarantine ground. Mercer held the map beneath the awning. Copper? A merchant named Cobb leaned closer. Surveyors found color near the eastern wash last spring. Arthur, still held by 2 deputies, said nothing. "That is why you needed her alive," Lydia said. Arthur's face had recovered some of its composure. He looked at her with a weary disdain, as though she had failed a lesson in arithmetic. "The land is useless without development," he said. "I intended to secure your future. You told Pike that after I signed I could stare at walls." Pike's exact words had been uglier. But Lydia did not need to repeat them. Arthur's eyes shifted. A hired man's vulgar joke. Was the locked room also a joke? The crowd stirred. For 3 nights, Lydia had slept in the upstairs bedroom with the door bolted from the corridor. Mrs. Bell brought meals and removed the tray even when nothing had been eaten. Arthur called it protection. 2 men remained on the porch below the window. Sheriff Mercer folded the wet petition. Put Mr. Vale in the side office. Not the cell yet. Keep someone at the door. Arthur straightened. I demand counsel. You may demand from a dry chair. The deputies took him inside. Mayor Rusk was led through the main entrance. The moment the courthouse swallowed him, the crowd's anger lost its clear target and began moving restlessly through the square. People spoke in low clusters. Some looked at Lydia and Kestrel. Others looked at the road, perhaps expecting soldiers or Apache riders to appear and give their fear a simpler shape. Sheriff Mercer sensed it. Guns down, he ordered. All of them. The militia hesitated. Thomas Price lowered his rifle first. The butt settled into the mud. One by one, the other barrels followed. Kestrel watched without triumph. Rain had darkened his hair and buckskins. Water ran along the scar beneath his left eye. He seemed less like an invader now than a tired man who had ridden hard for 3 days, with no certainty that he would arrive before something irreversible happened. Lydia saw the exhaustion around his mouth. You are hurt, she said in their shared language. Not badly. Pike struck you. Pike has a weak wrist. She almost smiled. Kestrel touched the torn seam at her shoulder. And you? The collar was worse than the rider's. His gaze went to the lace in the mud. Then the collar was foolish to challenge you. This time the smile came. It lasted only a second, but Eleanor Price saw it and began to cry. She turned away, embarrassed. Lydia watched her wipe her face with the same flower-marked cuff. Sheriff Mercer approached Kestrel. Will you come inside and give a statement? Kestrel looked at the courthouse door. Will she leave when she chooses? Yes. Will I? Mercer glanced at the militia. If no evidence says otherwise. Kestrel's expression told him that was not an answer. The sheriff took off his hat. Rain flattened his gray hair. You rode unarmed into 12 rifles and handed me evidence instead of using a blade. I have no wish to lock you up. But the territorial judge will ask how I verified this book and what the girl said. I need it written. Kestrel looked at Lydia. She nodded. We stay long enough to make the truth difficult to bury. He accepted that. Inside, the courthouse smelled of wet wool, lamp oil, old paper, and the coal stove that had not been lit since March. Deputy Sloan brought towels from the jailer's quarters. Eleanor found a plain cotton dress in the donation cupboard behind the church office. It was gray, too wide at the waist, and several inches too short, but Lydia chose it over the blue silk. Mrs. Bell offered to help her change. Lydia said no. Eleanor led her to the records room and waited outside with her back to the door. Lydia peeled off the wet dress. The stiff bodice had left red lines across her ribs. One sleeve was torn where Arthur caught her. Mud weighted the hem. She laid it on the floor without care. The gray dress smelled faintly of soap and cedar shavings. It had been mended at both elbows. Lydia pulled it over her head and tied the waist with a strip of cloth. She kept the turquoise outside the neckline. When she opened the door, Eleanor looked at the stone. I remember your mother owning one like that, she said. She sold it. Eleanor nodded slowly. For medicine, perhaps. That winter she sold her wedding ring to my husband. He gave her less than half its worth. Lydia waited. I knew, Eleanor said. I told myself we had children to feed. That was what we told ourselves about everything. The hallway carried the scrape of a chair from the sheriff's office, and Mayor Rusk's raised voice behind a closed door. Eleanor twisted her wet shawl between her hands. There is no apology large enough. No. The answer hurt Eleanor, but Lydia would not soften it into a lie. After a moment she added, You can still tell the truth. Eleanor looked up. That is not the same as undoing it, Lydia said. But it is something you can do now. Eleanor released the shawl. I will. In the sheriff's office, Kestrel sat in the chair nearest the window. He did not like rooms with one door. Lydia noticed that Mercer had noticed too. The sheriff left the window unlatched. Margaret's journal lay open on the desk between 2 dry cloths. Mercer had placed small metal weights at the corners to keep the pages flat. He wrote in a ledger, while Lydia translated Kestrel's account. Kestrel described the burning camp without ornament. He gave directions, distances, weather, and the number of guards he saw leave before the fire spread. He named the place where he found Lydia and the ridge from which they watched the cabins fall. Mercer paused. Why did you go in? Kestrel looked at him. The sheriff seemed uncomfortable with the question. But he did not withdraw it. Our people and yours were not at peace, Mercer said. You had reasons to leave the camp to its fate. Kestrel rubbed one thumb over the bruise on his opposite wrist. A child called? That was enough? Kestrel's gaze moved to Lydia. It should be. Mercer lowered his eyes to the ledger. Lydia sat on the edge of a wooden chair. The room's clock clicked too loudly. Each minute ended with a small internal snap. Mercer asked how Lydia had been treated over 10 years. Kestrel answered that she was fed when there was food, cared for when sick, taught what he knew, corrected when reckless, and allowed to remain angry as long as she needed. Did you teach her to call you father? No. When did she begin? Kestrel did not answer immediately. Lydia did. I was 8. Mercer's pen waited. It snowed early that year, she continued. We had gone to bring in 2 horses from the upper basin. One broke through river ice. Kestrel went after it, and the current took him under a shelf. I thought he was dead. She could see it again, the black opening in the ice, the rope burning her palms, Kestrel rising downstream with blood on his forehead. When he climbed out, I hit him with both fists, Lydia said. Then I called him father because I needed him to understand why I was angry. Kestrel's mouth moved slightly. Mercer wrote for a few moments. And what did he say? He said fathers should not fall through ice. For the first time, the sheriff smiled. The smile vanished when Deputy Sloan entered carrying another leather folder. We found this in Vale's room, he said. Bottom drawer, under the false panel. Mercer opened it. Inside were copies of the returned letters, notes from Pike, and a page of instructions in Arthur's hand. The instructions listed what the writers were to recover from Kestrel's lodge. The girl, any record kept by Margaret Vale, correspondence bearing Arthur's seal, and any object that might be offered as evidence of long-standing family attachment. The final line read, "The Indian must not be permitted to speak publicly with the girl before guardianship is established." Mercer passed the page to Lydia. Arthur had underlined publicly twice. "He knew I could speak," she said. "He knew more than that," Mercer replied. A second paper contained a memorandum from Arthur to Mayor Rusk, dated 10 years earlier. Most of it concerned the Eastern Road and debts against Margaret's land. Near the end, Arthur wrote that if no lawful heir survived the epidemic, the tract could be consolidated without obstruction. No direct order to burn appeared in the letter. It did not need to. The date was 1 day before Rusk signed the destruction decree. Kestrel read Lydia's face rather than the paper. "You did not know. I knew he left us. That is not the same." "No." Her hands began to shake. She put the letter down before the paper rattled. For years, Lydia had arranged the past into 2 kinds of people, those who abandoned and those who stayed. Arthur belonged to the first group. The letter placed him somewhere worse. He had not merely failed to come. He had watched the sickness move across a map and understood what Margaret's death might earn him. Lydia stood and went to the open window. Outside, rainwater spilled from the roof in a steady sheet. Townspeople crowded beneath porches. The feast remained abandoned, white cloth dragging red mud, flies gone, roses broken by the storm. Kestrel came to stand behind her, leaving enough space that she did not feel enclosed. "I want to go back to the cabin," Lydia said. "To the burned place?" "Yes." "Today she listened to the rain before we leave." Kestrel nodded. Mercer heard. "The quarantine ground is on Vale property." Lydia turned. "Is it?" The sheriff looked at the documents on his desk. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose that is the question." A knock sounded at the door. Thomas Price entered without his rifle. Water dripped from his beard. He held a narrow wooden box. "My wife said I should bring this." He set the box on the desk. Inside lay Margaret's wedding ring. It was plain gold, scratched nearly white along one edge. "I bought it from her before the camp closed," Thomas said. "Paid $3. It was worth 20. Lydia did not touch it. Thomas swallowed. "I kept meaning to give it to the girl if she was ever found." "Then why did you stand outside with a rifle?" Lydia asked. His face reddened. "I was afraid." "So was my mother." "I know. No, you know now." Thomas bowed his head. Kestrel looked at the ring, then at Lydia. He did not tell her to accept or refuse it. She closed the wooden box. "Sell it," she said. Thomas looked up. "Buy a marker for the people in the camp. Put all their names on it, not only my mother's. The ring belongs to you. So does the choice." Thomas placed both hands on the desk as if steadying himself. "It will be done." Not by Arthur's company. A breath that might have been a laugh escaped Mercer. Thomas nodded solemnly. From the side office came the crash of furniture. Arthur shouted, "You cannot keep me here while savages divide my property." Kestrel turned toward the sound. Lydia picked up the wet guardianship petition from Mercer's desk. The pencil mark still waited for her signature. She walked into the hall. Deputy Sloan had put Arthur in the narrow room where the town council stored election boxes and tax rolls. One chair lay on its side. Arthur stood behind the desk, wet coat removed, shirt sleeves held by silver bands. Without the coat and the crowd, he looked older. His hair had collapsed over his forehead. A vein pulsed near his temple. Mayor Rusk occupied the cell at the far end of the corridor. He had stopped shouting and begun praying in a voice that sounded more like bargaining. Arthur saw the petition in Lydia's hand. "Give me that!" She stopped outside the doorway. Sheriff Mercer and Kestrel remained a few paces behind her. Thomas Price moved to the wall. Arthur softened his face. The change was practiced but not perfect. "Lydia," he said, "you have heard accusations made in anger. You are young. You cannot understand what happens to land when no one manages it. Men take it. Banks take it. The territory sells it to strangers. I am trying to preserve what your mother meant you to have. My mother wrote what she meant me to have. A sick woman's diary is not a will. No, it is more honest." His jaw hardened. "You think the man behind you can protect you forever? He has no legal standing, no property, no recognized household. The army could remove his people next month. A bad winter could starve you. One patrol could decide he is an enemy and shoot him in front of you." Lydia felt Kestrel become very still. Arthur saw that he had found the old wound and pressed it. "In my house you would have tutors, servants, proper food. You could travel east. You could marry well. You could live without sleeping beside a knife. I slept beside a knife because men like you came with papers. This is childish, no. Childish was waiting at the window because I thought my grandfather might come." Arthur looked away first. Lydia held up the petition. "Did you know the camp was going to burn? Mayor Rusk made his own decisions. Did you know? I knew the epidemic threatened the town. Did you know my mother was still there?" Arthur's eyes moved to Sheriff Mercer. The sheriff said, "Answering may be unwise." Arthur seized on the warning, at last some sense. "But silence answers her too," Mercer added. Arthur's face darkened. Lydia waited. A fly struck the corridor window again and again, trapped between glass and curtain. From outside came the murmur of the crowd sheltering under the porch roof. Arthur spoke at last. "Your mother was already dying." The words were quiet. Lydia did not move. Arthur continued because men who had justified themselves for 10 years often could not stop once the door opened. She had the pox. The camp was failing. Rusk believed the infection would spread through scavengers, clothing, runoff, whatever the doctor told him. Margaret refused to sign the mineral lease before she became ill. She was stubborn, as your grandmother had been. But her condition had nothing to do with the order. You knew I was with her. I was told a child had crossed the rope, and you let them burn it. I was in Santa Fe. You sent the letter. Arthur struck the desk with his palm. I sent a business memorandum. I did not pour oil. I did not light a match. Do you imagine the world is divided between clean hands and guilty ones? Every town in the territory rests on a grave. Every railroad mile, every ranch, every mine. Someone is moved, someone loses water, someone dies. The only difference between men like me and men who starve is that I understand the cost. Kestrel's voice came from behind Lydia. You understand price? Arthur looked at him. Not cost, Kestrel said. The distinction entered the room and stayed there. Arthur laughed without humor. And what have you built? A camp that moves when soldiers appear? A life hidden in rocks? Kestrel answered, a place where she could sleep. Arthur's gaze returned to Lydia. You will regret this, perhaps. The calm of her answer unsettled him. You will regret many choices, she said, but they will be mine. She tore the petition once from top to bottom. Arthur lunged. Deputy Sloane caught him before he reached the doorway. Arthur fought with both hands, not like a gentleman, not like a grieving grandfather, but like a man watching the lock break on a treasure chest. Lydia tore the halves again, then again. The pieces fell across the corridor floor. One landed inside the council room. Arthur stared at it while Sloane forced his arms behind his back. The petition can be redrafted, Arthur gasped. The court will appoint me. Blood carries rights you cannot tear. Sheriff Mercer stepped over the paper fragments. Not after today. You have no authority to decide that. No. But I have authority to send the judge your letters. Pike's instructions, the journal, and sworn statements from every person who heard you admit knowledge of the camp. I suspect the judge will find another guardian, should the girl request one. I do not, Lydia said. Mercer looked at her. You are still 14. Kestrel is my guardian. The territory may not recognize that. Then the territory can learn. Mercer rubbed his jaw. It learns slowly. So do people. Eleanor had come into the corridor, some of us slower than others. She stood beside Thomas, not behind him. Several townspeople gathered at the open courthouse door, drawn by Arthur's raised voice. Mrs. Bell was among them. So were Cobb the merchant, the blacksmith, the school teacher, and 2 women who had lost family in the quarantine camp. Sheriff Mercer looked from Lydia to the crowd. The judge may require Lydia to remain in town until the hearing, he said. A chill moved through her despite the warm air. Arthur saw it. Hope returned to his face. Mercer continued. Or he may accept a sworn statement and release her to the person she identifies as her caretaker, especially if the town provides witnesses that she is acting freely. No one spoke. Lydia understood what the sheriff was doing. He could not make the law recognize Kestrel by force. He could make Ash Creek put its own name behind the truth. Eleanor stepped forward. I will sign. Thomas looked at her, then at Lydia. So will I. The school teacher raised her hand as if in class. I heard Lydia speak before the petition was destroyed. She understood its purpose. Cobb cleared his throat. I witnessed Arthur Vale's men bring her into town bound. Mrs. Bell began to cry. I locked the bedroom door. Mr. Vale ordered it. He said she would wander if given a chance. More voices followed. The testimony was not heroic. It came haltingly, with qualifications and shame. People admitted only what they had seen, then remembered one more thing. The jailer brought a fresh ledger. Mercer wrote names and statements while the corridor filled with wet boots, dripping hats, and the smell of bodies crowded close. Kestrel stood near the wall. Some townspeople avoided him. Others glanced at him and looked away quickly. A little boy stared openly at the bruise on his wrist. Did the ropes hurt? The boy asked. His mother pulled him back. Samuel. Kestrel answered, yes. The boy considered this. My pa said Apache men do not feel pain. Kestrel looked toward the father, who flushed beneath his beard. Your father has much to learn, Kestrel said. The boy nodded, satisfied. By late afternoon, the rain had weakened to a fine drizzle. The crowd moved from the corridor to the courtroom because there was no longer room to stand. Mercer called each witness forward. Eleanor described the white rope, the oil wagons, the screams. Thomas admitted that Mayor Rusk ordered armed men to block the wash. The blacksmith said he had repaired an axle on one of the wagons and found oil soaked into the bed the next morning. Mrs. Bell testified last. She stood with both hands gripping the rail. Mr. Vale came to my house 5 weeks ago, she said. He asked whether I could prepare a room for a young girl. He said she had lived with Indians and might be difficult. He told me not to speak to her about her mother. He said the girl's mind was weak and that too many questions could make her violent. Did she behave violently? Mercer asked. Mrs. Bell looked at Lydia. She broke a pitcher when I tried to take her necklace. A few people smiled despite themselves. Anything else? No. She sat by the window. She ate almost nothing. At night, I heard her moving the chair under the door handle, though the door was locked from outside. Did Mr. Vale ask you to witness the guardianship petition? Yes. Had Lydia agreed to sign it? No. Why was your name already on the line? Mrs. Bell's voice thinned. He said agreement would come. Arthur sat at the defense table under guard. This is theater, he said. A town cleansing its conscience by making one man carry every sin. Mayor Rusk, brought from the cell to hear the statements, turned toward him. You were willing enough to let me carry the fire. Mercer struck the table with a wooden block. Both of you will be silent. The courtroom settled. Lydia sat in the front bench with Kestrel. The wooden seat was hard. Her wet hair dried in loose waves down her back. Eleanor had given her a comb, but Lydia had left it unused in her pocket. Kestrel leaned close. You do not have to remain. I know. We can leave now. I know. Then why stay? Lydia watched Eleanor speak with the schoolteacher near the rail. Thomas stood alone by the window. Mrs. Bell sat with her face in her hands. The town was not transformed. It was merely unable for one afternoon to hide from itself. My mother wrote because she wanted someone to know, Lydia said. I want to hear them say they know. Kestrel nodded. Sheriff Mercer called her name. She walked to the witness rail. No Bible was placed before her. Mercer asked whether she promised to speak truth. Lydia touched the turquoise at her throat. Yes. He began with simple questions, her age, her mother's name, how long she had lived with Kestrel, whether she understood the guardianship papers. Then he asked about the night of the fire. Lydia looked at the room. 10 years earlier, these people had stood behind windows. Now they sat within reach of her voice. She could punish them with every detail. She could make them see the woman burning in the nightdress, the empty water basin, Margaret's cold hand. Part of her wanted to. But rage was not the same as truth. Kestrel had taught her that a hunter who loosed every arrow at once soon held an empty bow. She told only what she knew. She described the rope, the water stopped, the wagons. Rusk's voice. Her mother's final hours. Kestrel entering the cabin, she did not enlarge any image, she did not need to. When she said that Kestrel had touched Margaret's throat to see whether she lived, a woman in the second row began sobbing. When she said he saved the journal before carrying her out, the room turned toward him. Kestrel looked at the floor. Mercer asked, "Did he ever prevent you from returning to Ash Creek?" "No." "Did he teach you to hate the people here?" "No." "What did he teach you about them?" Lydia considered. "He said fear makes people small, but small people can still choose what they do next." Mercer looked at the townspeople. "And what do you choose?" "To leave with my father." Arthur stood so suddenly that his chair struck the wall. "You are a Vale." Lydia turned toward him. He pointed at Kestrel. "That man has given you no name recognized by God or law." Kestrel rose, but Lydia lifted one hand. He remained where he was. "My mother gave me Lydia," she said. "You gave me nothing." "I gave you blood. You gave my mother blood, too. It did not keep her alive." Arthur gripped the table edge. Lydia's voice did not rise. "Kestrel gave me mornings. He gave me work to do when grief made me useless. He sat outside the door when I could not bear anyone inside. He learned my language, and I learned his. He never asked me to become smaller so he could feel large. The room was completely still. That is why I called him father," she said. "Not because he told me to, because he stayed." Arthur's face seemed to empty from within. He sat down. Sheriff Mercer closed the ledger. "The statement is witnessed," he said. "Lydia Vale has chosen to leave Ash Creek in the care of Kestrel, known to this court through 10 years of conduct and today's testimony. I will transmit the record to the territorial judge. Until an order says otherwise, no person in this town will detain her." He looked directly at Arthur. "No person." The people in the courtroom stood, not in applause, but because the moment required movement and no one knew what else to do. Lydia returned to the bench. Kestrel placed one hand against the back of her head, briefly and gently. The gesture was almost invisible. It was enough. The courthouse emptied slowly. People moved as if leaving church after a funeral, speaking only when necessary. The rain had stopped. Water dripped from porch edges and flashed in the late light. Across the square, the ruined feast had begun to attract dogs. Eleanor and 3 other women gathered the food that could still be used. They carried bread and uncut meat to the jail kitchen, not for Rusk or Arthur alone, but for the deputies, witnesses, and families who had stayed through the storm. No one suggested continuing the celebration. Mrs. Bell brought Lydia's old boots from the Vale house. Lydia accepted the boots and left the blue dress behind. Sheriff Mercer gave Kestrel back the knife Pike's men had taken. It had been found among Arthur's effects, wrapped in a newspaper beside a list of items to be presented as proof of savagery. Kestrel examined the blade, then slid it into its sheath. "You kept no weapon when you came into town," Mercer said. "I had one." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Kestrel touched his head. "Here." Mercer almost laughed. Instead, he offered his hand. Kestrel looked at it. The sheriff began to lower it, uncertain. Then Kestrel took it. The grip lasted only a moment. Mercer said, "Pike will be arrested if he returns. He will not return soon." "You sound certain." "He believes courage and distance are the same thing." The sheriff nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. Lydia waited near the chestnut horse. Someone had rubbed it down and brought a bucket of water. The animal drank, lifted its dripping muzzle, and nudged her shoulder. She pressed her forehead to its cheek. Eleanor approached, carrying a cloth bundle. "Food for the trail," she said. "Cornbread, dried apples, salt pork, nothing fancy." Lydia took the bundle. "Thank you." The words surprised Eleanor. She held herself very still, afraid any movement might break the small gift. "I will give my statement again when the judge comes," she said. "I will say everything." Lydia tied the bundle to the saddle. "Then say the names first." "What names?" "The people in the camp. Do not begin with the mayor. Begin with the ones he wanted forgotten." Eleanor's mouth trembled. "I remember many. The journal has the rest." Sheriff Mercer had made copies of the relevant pages while the paper dried. The original journal was now wrapped again in oilcloth and secured in Kestrel's saddle roll. Eleanor looked toward the eastern edge of town. "Will you go there now?" "Yes." "May I come?" Lydia almost refused. The quarantine ground belonged to the dead, to Margaret, to the child Lydia had been, and to Kestrel who carried her out. Eleanor had watched from safety. But Lydia remembered what she said in the records room. "You can still tell the truth. You may walk behind us," she said. Thomas joined his wife. So did the blacksmith, the schoolteacher, Mrs. Bell, and 6 others whose relatives had died beyond the rope. No one organized the procession. They simply followed when Lydia and Kestrel turned east. The road crossed the wash where the quarantine line had once stood. 10 years of floodwater had erased the post holes. Mesquite grew thick along the bank. Pieces of charred glass still surfaced after rain, black and green among the stones. The cabins were gone. Only one foundation remained, a rectangle of dark rock half buried by grass. The old infirmary stove lay on its side beneath a cottonwood, rusted through at the bottom. Lydia stopped where she thought her mother's cabin had been. The landscape felt smaller than memory. As a child, the distance from the rope to the cabin had seemed endless. Now it was 20 paces. Kestrel walked toward a low rise near the wash. Beneath a juniper stood a pile of flat stones, carefully fitted together. Weather had grayed them. A small piece of red cloth remained tied to one branch, faded almost white. Lydia looked at him. "I returned the next winter," he said. "When the ground was cold. You never told me. You did not ask where I put the stones." She climbed the rise. At the center of the cairn lay a smooth river rock marked with a simple M. Kestrel had carved the letter years after the rescue, when Lydia taught him enough English to know which one began Margaret. Lydia knelt. Her hands rested on the wet earth. The smell was not smoke now. It was rain grass and the sharp green scent of the juniper. For a long time she said nothing. The townspeople stopped at the bottom of the rise. Even Eleanor did not come closer. Kestrel stood several steps away, giving Lydia the privacy of his presence. She took the turquoise from her neck and laid it on the stone. The blue-green color brightened against the gray. "My mother wanted me to have one," she said. "I did not know. I know. Do you leave it?" Lydia considered. Then she lifted the stone and returned it to her neck. "No. She told me to keep it close." Wind moved through the wet grass. Lydia opened the journal. She turned to the last page Margaret had written. The ink wandered downward as the fever weakened her hand. She read aloud. Not the entire entry. Only the final lines. "If Lydia lives, let no one tell her she was unwanted because cowards failed her. Let her know I held her as long as I could. Let her know love is not proved by blood, title, or promise. It is proved by who remains when remaining has a cost." Lydia's voice failed on the last word. Kestrel looked toward the mountains. Eleanor covered her face. Thomas removed his hat. Others followed. No one offered a speech. After a while, the blacksmith began collecting loose stones. He carried them to the cairn and set them along the base. The schoolteacher joined him, then Thomas. They worked without asking permission, not changing Kestrel's marker, only widening the ground around it so more names could be added. Eleanor knelt in the wet grass and began speaking the names she remembered. "Sarah Crowley," she said. "Ben Crowley. Ruth Ames. The little laundry girl was called Nell. I never knew her family name." The schoolteacher repeated each name and wrote it in a small notebook. Lydia listened until the light turned amber. When Eleanor reached Margaret Vale, she stopped. Lydia said the name herself, Margaret Vale. The teacher wrote it down. The dead had not been restored. The town had not been forgiven. But their names occupied air again, and the air did not refuse them. Sheriff Mercer arrived near sunset with a deputy and 2 saddled horses. He dismounted at the edge of the foundation. "Rusk has asked for a preacher," he said. "Arthur has asked for 3 lawyers and hot supper." Kestrel glanced at the food bundle on his saddle. He may have the lace collar. Lydia laughed before she could stop herself. The sound carried across the wash. Several townspeople smiled. It was not a happy place, but life had entered it again. Mercer handed Lydia a folded document. "This is a copy of your statement and my temporary order. It says you leave by your own will and are not to be detained by any citizen or officer of Ash Creek." She read it carefully. At the bottom, Mercer had written Kestrel's name as she spelled it for him, followed by the words chosen guardian. The law had learned one small thing. Lydia folded the paper and placed it inside the journal. "What will happen to the land?" she asked. "The court will decide ownership after the criminal inquiry. Arthur's leases are likely frozen. The railroad will complain. The mining company will complain louder. I do not want the land sold over these graves. Tell the judge. Will he listen?" Mercer looked toward the cairn and the people writing names. "He will have difficulty pretending he did not hear." Lydia nodded. She did not tear the land from the earth by tearing a paper. She understood that now. There would be hearings, letters, maps, and men who treated delay as a weapon. She might need to return. She might need to learn more English law than she ever wished to know. But those would be later choices. The choice before her was the road north. She mounted behind Kestrel. Eleanor stood near the old foundation with mud on her dress and Margaret's name in her mouth. Will you come back? Lydia looked at the town beyond the wash. The setting sun touched the courthouse windows and turned them red. When there is reason. Eleanor accepted that. Kestrel guided the chestnut onto the road. No bell rang. No speeches followed. The people at the quarantine ground watched them leave with their hats in their hands. At the edge of Ash Creek, Lydia looked back once. Arthur Vale stood behind the barred window of the side office. From that distance he was only a pale shape. He raised one hand to the glass. Lydia did not know whether it was a farewell, a demand, or another attempt to call her back. She faced the mountains. The trail climbed through low hills washed clean by rain. Water shone in hoofprints. Quail moved beneath the brush, calling to one another. The air smelled of creosote and damp stone. For the first mile, Lydia sat straight and alert. Each bend might hide Pike or one of Arthur's men. Kestrel felt the tension in her arms. "They are gone," he said. "You do not know." "No, then why say it?" "Because your hands are hurting my ribs." She loosened her grip on his shirt. A few minutes later, she leaned against his back. They rode until the town's roofs disappeared. The trail entered a narrow cut where water still trickled along one side. Kestrel stopped beneath an overhang to rest the horse. Lydia slid down. Her legs shook from exhaustion. She drank from his canteen, then poured water over her bare feet. The cuts from the square stung. Kestrel crouched and examined them. "You ran through broken dishes," he said. "I did not notice. Feet notice later." He cleaned each cut with water and wrapped the worst one in a strip torn from an old shirt. His hands were careful. Lydia watched the bruises around his wrists. "Show me," she said. "They are nothing. That is what foolish people say when they want others to stop asking." Kestrel extended his arms. The rope had broken skin in 2 places. Lydia cleaned the wounds with the same water and tied cloth around them. Neither spoke until she finished. Then she struck his shoulder. He accepted the blow. "You let them take me, yes? I know why. Yes? I am still angry. You may be." She struck him again, weaker. "I thought you would die before you came. I thought the same of you." This answer stopped her. Kestrel sat beside her beneath the rock. The chestnut tore grass near the trail. Water ticked from the overhang. "I followed the first day," he said. "Pike left 2 men at the southern pass. I went east, found Sonny's grandson with the journal, then rode through the night. Near the river, soldiers stopped me. Arthur had sent word that an Apache kidnapper might approach town." Lydia looked at the bruise along his jaw. "They held you?" "Until morning. One had met me before. He knew I traded horses, not children. You might not have arrived. No, you came without a rifle. With a rifle, they would see only the rifle. They nearly saw only you. Yes." The simplicity of his answers angered and comforted her at once. Lydia pulled her knees up and rested her forehead on them. "When I saw you, I forgot every careful thing you taught me. You crossed the rifles when they were confused. That was not a plan. It was a good use of confusion." She looked at him. "You are impossible. So English has told me." They ate Eleanor's cornbread under the overhang. It was dry at the edges and sweet with molasses. Kestrel gave Lydia the larger piece without comment. She broke it in half and returned part to him. When they mounted again, evening had settled between the hills. The trail rose steadily. Ash Creek became a glow behind them, then nothing. Stars appeared one at a time. They camped that night beside a spring hidden under sycamores. Kestrel built a small fire, no larger than a cooking pot. Lydia sat close enough to feel its heat, but not so close that sparks could reach her dress. For years she had believed the fear of fire was gone. In Ash Creek, smoke had found the old door inside her and opened it. Kestrel placed 2 green branches across the flames. They hissed and released the clean smell of juniper. "This fire is ours," he said. Lydia watched until her breathing slowed. She took Margaret's journal from the saddle roll. The cover was still damp near one corner. Using a cloth, she dried each page and turned it carefully. Kestrel repaired the oilcloth while she worked. Near the front, Lydia found a lock of her childhood hair tied with yellow thread. She had seen it before, but tonight it felt different. It belonged to a girl in the orchard, before the rope, before the canyon. Lydia held it beside her present hair, darkened by sun and wind. "Do you remember her?" Kestrel asked. "The little girl?" "Yes. Some days. Is she gone?" Lydia returned the lock to the page. "No, but she is not the only one here." Kestrel nodded. She had once thought survival meant becoming someone new enough that the old pain could no longer find her. Now she understood that she carried every version of herself. Margaret's child, the fevered orphan, the angry girl at the canyon entrance, the rider who knew the mountain paths, the silent prisoner in blue silk, the voice in the courtroom. None canceled the others. Before sleeping, she asked, "What did you think when I called you father the first time?" Kestrel looked into the coals. "I thought I had been given something I might fail to keep. You never told me that. You were already afraid I would die in rivers. I was right to be." He added wood to the fire. "What did you think today, when I called you?" "Yes." Lydia lay back on her blanket. Through the branches she could see a strip of stars. "I thought the whole town had spent 3 days telling me who I was. I wanted one word that belonged to me." Kestrel was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "It belongs to us." At dawn they continued north. The land rose into broken mesas and narrow valleys. Rainwater rushed through channels that had been dust the week before. They crossed one stream where the chestnut sank to its knees, then climbed switchbacks cut into the red slope. Lydia recognized a lightning-split pine and the white scar of quartz in the cliff. Home announced itself in ordinary ways. A strip of blue cloth tied to a branch marked the safe trail. Fresh hoofprints crossed the mud. Smoke lifted from behind the ridge, thin and straight in the cool morning. Someone had left a bundle of gathered onions beneath a rock shelf to dry. At the final bend, Saini stood beside the juniper tree with her arms folded. She was small, gray-haired, and bent in one shoulder, but Pike's men had been more afraid of her than of anyone else in the canyon. She looked first at Lydia's borrowed gray dress, then at Kestrel's bruised face. "You took too long," she said. Kestrel dismounted. The town talked. Towns do that when work would be useful. Lydia slid from the horse. Sani caught her before her injured foot touched the ground. The old woman held her hard, smelled her hair, and pushed her back to inspect her face. "They fed you badly. They offered roast beef. Then why are you thin?" "I did not eat it." Sani nodded with approval. "Good. Their beef tastes afraid." People emerged from among the lodges. The boy who carried the journal rode up grinning. Children shouted. A woman brought water. Someone touched Lydia's shoulder and withdrew. No one demanded a story at once. Kestrel untied Eleanor's food bundle and handed the dried apples to the children. Within minutes, the solemn return became an argument over who had taken the largest piece. Lydia stood beneath the juniper where Pike's bullet had broken the cooking pot. The pot remained beside the fire, hammered roughly back into shape. A patch covered the hole. She ran her thumb over the dent. Nothing was untouched. Everything useful had been repaired. That evening she put on her old buckskin shirt, soft from years of wear. The neckline rested below the raw mark left by the lace. She sat beside Kestrel while Sani cooked corn and rabbit in the mended pot. The canyon filled with the sounds Lydia had carried in memory. Stone against stone, a baby fussing, a horse shaking its mane, people speaking without lowering their voices because she had returned. No one called her Clara. Months later, a rider from Ash Creek brought a packet sealed by the territorial court. Mayor Rusk had been indicted for the deaths at the quarantine camp. Arthur Vale faced charges of conspiracy, unlawful confinement, and attempted fraud. Pike had been arrested near Tucson after trying to sell one of Arthur's horses. The judge recognized Lydia's statement and allowed her to remain with Kestrel while the land case continued. He did not understand the phrase chosen guardian, but Sheriff Mercer had written it so many times in the record that the court finally used it too. Lydia returned to Ash Creek once that winter. She wore no silk. She sat beside Kestrel in the courtroom and read Margaret's journal into the official record. Outside, workers raised a stone marker at the eastern wash. Thomas Price had sold the ring, added money of his own, and hired no company connected to Arthur. The marker listed 37 names. The last line read, "and those whose names were not preserved." Eleanor stood with Lydia while snow moved thinly across the ground. "I used to think remembering was the same as being good," Eleanor said. "It is not, I know, but it can stop the next lie." Eleanor looked toward the courthouse where Arthur waited for the judge. "Will you ever forgive us?" Lydia considered the word. It was too large to promise and too simple for what had happened. "I will not spend my life answering that question for you," she said. Eleanor bowed her head. "Fair enough." Lydia returned to the mountains before the verdicts were announced. Years passed. The mine never opened on the quarantine ground. After a long fight, the court placed that portion of the Vale tract beyond sale and recognized it as a burial site. Lydia retained the high acreage but refused Arthur's leases. She allowed families from Ash Creek to graze animals there during drought if they asked rather than claimed. Some did. Some never could. By the time Lydia was grown, She could move between the town and the canyons without belonging wholly to either world's idea of her. She translated letters, argued with officials, helped mothers find medicine, and walked out of rooms when men confused patience with surrender. Kestrel grew slower. Gray entered all of his hair. He still watched from high places. One autumn evening they rode to the ridge above the valley. Ash Creek shone far below, a handful of lamps beside the dark wash. Behind them, smoke from the canyon fires rose into the cold air. Lydia wore the turquoise at her throat. Margaret's journal rested in her saddlebag, wrapped in new oilcloth but carrying the old smoke in its pages. Kestrel looked toward the lights below. "Do you regret leaving?" "No. Do you regret returning?" Lydia thought of the marker, the courtroom. Eleanor saying the names, Arthur behind the glass. The torn collars dissolving in mud. No. The wind moved over the ridge and brought the scent of cedar from home. Kestrel turned his horse toward it. Lydia followed. Below them lay the town where she had been born. Ahead waited the place where she had been known. Blood had given her a history. Grief had given her scars. The law had tried to give her an owner. But home had been decided by a simpler measure. Home was the person who entered the fire. Home was the hand that did not close around her, but stayed open until she chose to take it. Home was the man who had never asked her to call him anything at all. As darkness settled across the mountains, Lydia rode beside her father, and neither of them needed to say they had arrived.